Today we're talking about why restorative practices. What's the purpose of RP in schools? Why would a school become restorative? And why for us as educators is it important to work restoratively? The most prominent answer, I suppose, that people give for why RP is because it works. Those of us who've used RP know that it effectively changes kids' behaviour. And the studies have shown that it reduces recidivism, that it goes some way towards treating the harm, dealing with the harm that conflict and wrongdoing cause in schools. And there's some indication, and a lot of anecdotal indication, that working restoratively helps academic outcomes as well. So we know it works. It's effective. It enables us to follow processes which change kids' behaviour. But that's not my answer to why restorative practices. And to explore that, I'd like to introduce you to Jack. If Jack doesn't know how to do something in our class, then we teach him. If he doesn't know how to read or how to solve an equation or how to construct an essay, we teach him. And we do that again and again and again as long as Jack needs it. If he asks us for the 14th time to explain how to do something in one of our classes, then we patiently sit there and explain it or find a different way. We look creatively for how can we work around this? How can we get Jack to understand this particular approach that he's not seeing at the moment? But if he has problems with behaving or caring for other people or getting along or being considerate or thoughtful, the conventional wisdom is just that we should punish him. Not something that we would ever do if he has a problem with our coursework. If he can't solve an equation, we're not going to say, well, you go out of my class and you don't come back into my class until you can solve that equation. It'd be ridiculous. So my answer to why restorative practices in a school is because we're teachers. It's part of our job as teachers, in fact a critical part of our job as teachers, to work with children on their whole makeup. Not just the academic and not just behavioural, but how do they get on with each other? How do they work with each other? What do they think? What are their attitudes? Now there's a set of notes accompanying this presentation that includes all of the quotes and diagrams from today's presentation. So if we start by having a look at the definition of pedagogy, the best definition I've seen is from this Australian publication in 2003, that what we do in schools is reasoned, moral, human interaction within a reflective, educative context that facilitates the acquisition of new knowledge, beliefs, or skills. I like the fact that it focuses on knowledge, beliefs, and skills, not just academic knowledge. But the first four words are the critical ones to me. Our pedagogy, and by pedagogy I mean everything that we do in a school that's designed for the development of the young people that we serve. Our pedagogy is reasoned. It's very heavily reasoned. We can explain why we do what we do. We can we study it. We work it out in advance. It's moral because all work involving people has a moral dimension. So it's moral here not just because we're trying to teach kids right from wrong, but it's moral because there's a right and a wrong way of doing what we do in schools. But the last two words are key. It's human interaction. It's a human interaction between a developmentally mature adult, that's the teacher, and a developmentally immature young person, the student. Now, in our courses, to facilitate the acquisition of new knowledge and skills, we do all these things. We plan out the curriculum, we define objectives, we teach them what and how to do things, we show them how to do it, we give them guided practice, we correct them when they make errors, we challenge and inspire them to try again and again and again. We help them to learn to do it the right way. We put a lot of time into reasoning and to performing this pedagogical task, to teach kids new knowledge or skills. And our practice in this field could be put on a two-dimensional field of practice like this, a graph of expectations on the left-hand side on the vertical axis versus scaffolding or support on the horizontal axis. By expectations on the left, I mean expectations, not just standards. When we walk into a classroom, do we really expect that the kids can succeed at what they're doing? It's very different from having high standards. We might have high standards and we could fail everybody on a task. That's very different from having high expectations, which is that we honestly believe that kids can get this material, that kids can understand this and they can learn these skills. So we know that if we go into a classroom with low expectations and little offer of support for the kids, they're going to be defeated before they start. That's not a classroom in which achievement is going to be the mark. But similarly, if we give the kids a lot of support, but we don't really expect that they're going to achieve well, that's quite dismissive of the kids. I think they would experience that as dismissive of the kids' ability and potential. Of course, if we walk into a classroom with very high expectations, but we're not prepared to show kids how to do things, to support them and scaffold the work, then the kids are going to experience that as demanding, but not necessarily very empowering. We want to go into a classroom with high expectations and with the willingness to scaffold and support the work. And the kids will experience this as encouraging and empowering. It's demanding work, but we're there to support the kids and to encourage them to get to that standard of work. So we all know this when we walk into a classroom. With Jack, if we go back to the classwork versus what we've commonly called behavioural issues, we have a list of cognitive capacities that we're aiming to instill in our students. And I suppose, for want of a better term, we could describe a list of non-cognitive capacities that we want to instill. Honesty, compassion, respect, empathy, resilience, and so on. Now, if we look at any school's mission statement or value statement, you're going to see a lot of these terms on the right-hand side, whether it's a faith-based school or a secular school. There are very few schools that don't overtly value honesty, compassion, respect, empathy, and so on down the list. And in fact, if we have a shitty day at work, if we go home and things are not going well, it's very rarely because some kid has got something on the left-hand column wrong. It's more often a relationship breakdown because somebody hasn't shown respect or compassion or honesty or thoughtfulness. In other words, a non-cognitive capacity. They're important to us in our mission statements and they're important to us in our realities. I'm not saying that the cognitive capacities are less important, but we have a more resilient attitude to them, if you like. We'll try again tomorrow to teach Jack how to solve that equation. We don't have the same approach to the non-cognitive capacities. Now, the QCAA has these non-cognitive capacities listed in the 21st century skills. It lists the cognitive ones of critical thinking, creative and communication. But it also lists the non-cognitive ones of collaboration and teamwork, personal and social skills. Nigel Latter, a New Zealand psychologist, has a slightly different list of 21st century skills. He says it's important for kids to come out of school with critical thinking, collaboration, cooperation and creativity, and not being a dick. So in that 21st century skill list, he's got something which is really a non-cognitive capacity, not being a dick. Now, you'll notice I draw a fair bit on the work of Bruce Perry, an American psychiatrist and neuroscientist who works with the Child Trauma Academy. And he makes the point that humans become humane, that we're not born humane, it's a product of our nurture. He says the capacity to care, to share, to listen, to value, and to be empathic. In other words, to be compassionate. The sort of non-cognitive capacities which are in every school's mission statement develops from being cared for, shared with, listened to, valued, and nurtured. In other words, it's a result of our experience. Vygotsky, almost 100 years ago, made the same point, and he constructed the role of the teacher as providing the social interaction wherein cognitive and emotional growth of the young person occurs. We're all familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, but it's usually constructed in terms of a task. We want to design a task which is not too easy, that it's not something that the kids can already do. It's not too hard, that's not inaccessible, but that is in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, the region in which the child can do the task with in collaboration with us today, in the hope that tomorrow he or she will be able to do it on their own. And a lot of people, the original translation of Vygotsky missed out the emotional aspect of it, but Vygotsky was very clear that the role of the teacher in a school was not just the cognitive growth, but the emotional growth, and that both were the result of working in the zone of proximal development. So after Perry, this diagram here represents the fundamental transaction of a school, the purpose of a school, and the fundamental reason for its existence, and the technology of the school. A developmentally mature adult interacting with a developmentally immature young person with the hope of that causing maturation, causing development. And what we see, of course, is that in this model, every person is the result of myriad interactions of this type over many, many years. The students in front of us, perhaps fewer than we have, but the students in front of us are the result of every interaction they've had with another person, every social, emotional interaction that they've had with another person, good or bad, millions upon millions of them over the years. We become humane as a result of that series of interactions. Perry points out that the development of the brain is very much like the development of muscle. It's a use-dependent process. Those neurons that we use are strengthened and grow. Those neural connections, the synapses between the neurons that represent learning, those ones that are repeated and repeatedly used are strengthened and preserved, and those that aren't used wither away. We instinctively know this. We know that for a student to learn something in a cognitive sense, they have to practice it. They have to rehearse it. They have to revisit it. It's repetition that causes these neural pathways to be etched stronger and therefore strengthened. If we look at Bruce Perry's four-part model of the brain, it's a simplified model of the brain. The base part of the brain, the most primitive part of the brain, is the brainstem. And this is the part of the brain this is the only part of the brain that needs to be fully developed at birth. Just above the brainstem is the Diencephalon. The brainstem is responsible for keeping us alive. It monitors and controls our heartbeat and breathing rate and temperature regulation, the physiological functions of life. It also functions to take in stimulus from the senses, from the environment, and monitor for threat. The Diencephalon above that is responsible for movement and coordination. and it develops in the first 1 to 3 years of life, the toddler period, where the young person learns to crawl and then to walk and start developing fine motor skills. The brainstem and diencephalon taken together are what we call the lizard brain, or the reptilian brain, and they would keep us alive because they could move us around and find food, find a mate, they could propagate the species, they'd protect us from threat, but they're the most primitive part of the brain. Above the diencephalon is the limbic system. The limbic system is the seat of emotion and our emotional lives. And this part would make up what we call the mammalian brain. So dogs have limbic systems similar to us. And above the limbic system is the part that makes us human, the human brain, the cortex, the neocortex, and in particular the prefrontal cortex, is where we do our cognition. It's where we have our executive function, self-regulation, the role of the brain in forecasting outcomes, predicting consequences of scenarios, and making decisions between them. Now, in schools, the timeline of development is such that we're working with kids whose limbic system and cortex are being redeveloped at the time. That's the period of greatest plasticity. The school years are the period of greatest plasticity of the limbic system and then the cortex. So the greatest opportunity to encourage brain development occurs in the schooling years, in these two parts, the limbic system and the cortex. There are two periods of enormous neuroplasticity, the growth of neurons and the connections between them. Early childhood is the first one, way before they come to school, but adolescence is the second, which, as we'll see these days, commences around age 10 or thereabouts, and continues through for some until the 20s. So if we look at a slide, a histological slide of the brain representing here at birth, and then at age 6 we see there's enormous growth, profligate growth in neurons and synapses, the connections. Bruce Perry says that this is an enormous period of growth. I forget the actual numbers, but so many billions of neurons are produced every minute in the early period. By age 14, you notice that the neurons start to thin out, and this is the process of pruning, that those neural circuits which aren't used fall into disrepair, and those that are used are strengthened. So the development of physical skills, the development of cognitive skills in the school years actually changes the brain of the young person. That's the process of neuroplasticity. Gouraud, the neuroscientist, says the more exposure to and experience of empathy, decision-making, impulse control and compassion during childhood and through adolescence, the more those neural circuits will be strengthened and prevented from being pruned. And that's our desire in schools. So Perry recognises that while each child has their own genetic potential, how that genetic potential is going to be expressed will depend on the quality, the timing and the pattern of their developmental experience, of their experience of working or being in the care of developed, mature adults. So it's this idea again that humans become humane as the result of these continual interactions that we have. And if you consider the interactions that a school student has with the number of teachers and adults in the school over many years, it's indeed a great number.